Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Lay out for people what the real problem with the UN Arms Trade Treaty is, and then we can talk about how they're trying to push this on us and the constitutional issues, but talk about the substance of it right now.
The substance of it is it requires the registration of all ammunition, arms, and component parts. It gives control over those to regional departments of the United Nations. It requires member states, meaning the United States included, to keep a list of gun owners. It empowers the United Nations to send troops in to enforce disarmament should any member state find it difficult to disarm its citizens. It requires tracking to the end user of the by the manufacturer of any firearm, ammunition, or component part. And at the end of the day, it will lead to the complete disarmament of a civilian population.
Yeah, this is full spectrum gun control. They're not looking at something and saying, well, you know, we're going to ban guns that we think we're going to call them assault weapons and say that they look scary. So, you know, if you've got a bayonet attachment on the end, we're going to ban that. No, it's not piecemeal like that. It is everything, denying the right to own guns, taking out ammunition, taking out spare parts, as you point out, creating this massive registry and demanding that no one can own anything associated with a firearm.
Right. And under Article 16 of the Arms Trade Treaty, it does empower the Secretary General to deploy peacekeepers to any nation whose leaders or legislative body finds it difficult to disarm. So that's Article 16, and it will help. It will help that leader or that nation with what it calls stockpile management, disarmament, and demobilization. So wow. You can interpret that the way you think it should be interpreted.
Well, the way I interpret that is Lexington and Concord, because they went after the stockpiles there. What's that?
Yeah, you're the first one. You're the first one who's really caught on to that. You know, when the bullets started flying at the War for Independence, it was because King George's troops were coming for the ammunition.
Man, yeah, absolutely. This is full spectrum. Now let's talk about how they have manipulated this thing from the very beginning, because they had come up, and we know, even the New York Times pointed out, that Fast and Furious was set up to blame the Second Amendment. And, of course, a key part of Fast and Furious was to move guns across the border. And so that's exactly what this purports to take care of. That is the rationale for having to have a UN arms trade treaty, because it's not enough that we just have this problem as they perceive it in America where individuals can own guns. No, our guns are going across the border to other people. So that was a set piece. That was something that was set up to basically get the public afraid of this, to demonstrate the need for it. And it blew up in their face. I was there in July in New York at the United Nations. We were filming that. We were reporting on that. And they had the people there. It had just blown up about this officer getting killed. And people had realized what was going on with Fast and Furious. So that blew up in their face. And then, of course, they have the shooting that was perfectly timed just as they were about to have the vote. So they delayed all of that until after the election, they said. They didn't wait very long. On the very day of the election, as soon as they saw the Democrats were going to be picking up seats, they said, we're going to revisit this back in the spring after the Democrats are in Congress. And, of course, Joe, they didn't get that ratified by the Senate. Nevertheless, John Kerry, Secretary of State, signed it. So talk to us about the constitutionality of all of that.
Well, I mean, the constitutionality is there is none. There is specifically the Second Amendment says, as you know, and all of your viewers know, shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed unless there's armed violence. Shall not be infringed unless there's a mass shooting. It's shall not be infringed. And the thing that most people, most good, well-intentioned constitutionalists and lovers of liberty don't understand is the Second Amendment has nothing to do with self-defense in the narrow way. It has self-defense in the wider Lockean way. That is to say, when the government becomes abusive of your rights, it is your duty and your obligation and your right to throw off that government. And at the end of the day, our founding fathers understood that the Second Amendment had nothing to do with protecting yourself from burglars. It had everything to do with protecting yourself from tyrants. And the United Nations, no one is more tyrannical in its conception and in its operation than the United Nations. And they understand, they have learned the lesson of history. You know, a gun without a bullet is just a club.
Yes.
So go for the ammunition. And I'll tell you the story of I was invited by the ambassadors of Mexico and Spain to speak at the convention where they finally where they were drafting the arms trade treaty back in March of, I think it was 2012. And I went to that and spoke there at their little meeting on behalf of the Second Amendment. And these guys understood very well and made no uncertain terms that the goal of this ultimately is disarmament. But the way to get there, the best way to get there, is to focus on the ammunition. And
yes,
they specifically, something that most people don't know, and I've written about, but to my dismay, it hasn't gotten enough traction, which is the fact that it is the ammunition. And at this meeting of the Mexican and sponsored by Spain and Mexico there at the UN, they mentioned specifically that they were working on, in Germany, they were working on technology that was a tiny chip that would be implanted in every round. And that chip would be required by international law to be used by every manufacturer of ammunition. And that chip would cause the round of ammunition to self-destruct after it had been used one time, meaning the end to all reloading, of course.
Yes. And we're talking about reloading. At the very beginning of the Obama administration, they've understood that that ammunition is the key thing. As you pointed out, a gun without ammunition is just a club. At the very beginning of this, they started out by not allowing the U.S. military to recycle their brass. Remember, they pulled that back, and then there was a couple of senators who came back and fought against that. And then a couple of years later, we uncovered some evidence that showed that they were still at a New York fort, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but they were still recycling this brass in terms of crushing it and selling it to China as scrap, spending money to crush it, selling it to China as scrap metal for far less than they could sell it back into the American market, which is what the military has always done with their scrap brass. So they get rid of the brass. They start making lead illegal in California. They want to do that nationwide. They want to outlaw lead ammunition. So they understand not only it's a full spectrum attack, not just this UN arms trade treaty, but they want to get even to the components of ammunition. And as you pointed out about the Second Amendment, it's about it references infringement, because I think they always visualize that this is going to be a gradual process, and it has been a gradual process of infringement until now. Now they're getting very bold. With this UN arms trade treaty, they're going for the whole enchilada. As I said, full spectrum, gun control, all components, all aspects of it. And
people don't realize, everyone says, well, if the blue helmets come for my gun, they'll pry it from my cold, dead fingers. Well, it doesn't have anything to do with the blue helmets. It'll be your local law enforcement that has been co-opted by the federal government.
Yes.
I mean, we are seeing now that with the Department of Homeland Security and with the Department of Defense giving grants and the Homeland Security creating fusion centers, the local law enforcement is something that just doesn't exist anymore. They're all simply outposts of the larger federal military law enforcement complex. It's becoming a thing where it won't be a blue helmeted UN soldier. It'll be the local deputy sheriff, who has been armed to the teeth by Homeland Security and the Department of Defense. They show up to serve bench warrants with a anti-personnel vehicle, and so an armored personnel vehicle, and that's how they'll show up to serve the warrant to you, the notice to you that you haven't complied with the law requiring registration of firearms. If you want to know exactly how it'll go down, just read the history of the past 20 years or so of the United Kingdom and Australia, and that'll tell you exactly how it'll go down. It'll all be enforced by your local law enforcement acting on behalf of the federal government. And of course, they may just kind of wait us out. There was the fellow who did the wargaming scenario, used to teach and still did teach at the military college in South Carolina, essentially talking about a revolution of Tea Partiers there and how that was going to play out in a scenario. But one of the things that he controversially said was, I will pry that out of your cold, dead hands. Hopefully, when you've died from natural causes. We're just going to wait this out. We're going to just continually infringe on this until there's nothing left, and then we're going to come for the little cleanup operations that we need to do elsewhere. But one of the things I want to talk about out of your article, you pointed out the irony of this happening on Christmas Eve, and you spent a lot of time talking about
Christians' involvement and the understanding of where our rights come from, that they transcend government. They come directly from God. And of course, at the Berlin Wall, when it fell down, it was the Christians who en masse went to the wall after having met for 7 years and setting their churches up as a place where people could come and freely talk about politics openly and could come and pray for their country. After 7 years of that, they marched on the wall, almost like it was Jericho, except it wasn't 7 days, it was 7 years. It's a long process. It's a revival process. I want to talk to Joe Wolverton about the transcendent issues when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight in Austin. We have on the line with us Joe Wolverton from the newamerican.com, talking about his article that the UN declares that they're going to put the arms trade treaty into effect on December 24th. Now, we've talked about the scope of this. We've talked about how clever the government has become in their gun control efforts, how they have focused on ammunition. And, of course, we talked about how they early on stopped brass recycling from the military because, of course, the military makes their own ammunition. They stopped that and then restarted it after senators protested that. But then it appears we have information. It looks like they may have continually stopped that and are recycling that rather than putting it back into the market. But of course, as Nico reminded me, the whole thing with the DHS that Paul Joseph Watson broke here at InfoWars, the fact that they're buying billions of rounds of ammunition and the ammunition shortages that they caused out of that, that was coming out of the general market because, as I mentioned before, the military makes their own ammunition. So they have understood that it's about ammunition. They're working on infringing our basic rights, but now this is coming for the entire thing. This is full spectrum gun control, registration, ammunition, parts, everything. Denying the right of individuals to own weapons, and then also putting in an enforcement mechanism saying that they will enforce it with the UN, although they may have the local police working for them. I want to go back to Joe, and Joe, one of the things that we didn't talk about in the last segment, of course, was the aspect of the transcendent right that we have, the fact that the Constitution just merely recognizes those. These are rights that we possess as human beings from our Creator. Going back to the Declaration of Independence, that understanding of our rights. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I tell people all the time when I give speeches that there are books that if you want to be part of what's going to happen, if you want to be part of taking this country back to the place it needs to be, the place it was destined to be, then you've got to read some of these books that the founders read that informed them and taught them from the cradle that we are endowed. They did not create this idea. Thomas Jefferson did not, out of the blue, decide that we were endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. He discovered this from very little. And it's funny to understand that from the time that the federal government took control of education, all of these people, all of their writings, people that most of your viewers probably haven't heard of, these people, Emmerich de Vattel and Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui and Samuel Pufendorf and Algernon Sidney, these people that were all over the writings and journals of our founding fathers were completely scrubbed from the notion of history, mainly to keep the idea out of our minds that we are endowed by our Creator with certain rights. And among those is the right to protect our life. And Alexander Hamilton explained it very well in the Federalist Papers, number 27 and 28, that the purpose is to throw off tyranny. John Locke, he learned it from John Locke as well. And John Locke learned it from those other guys that
well, they could even go. They could even go, Joe, to the Bible, couldn't they? And have a bit of a revival to understand that we have to stand up for the defenseless, for those who are being oppressed. It was Jesus who overthrew the money changers, got angry about that. Why is there no anger on the part of Christians when we see oppression? When we see oppression coming from our own government, too often I see Christians give government a carte blanche to do whatever they want to because of a misunderstanding of Romans. And we've had pastors on to talk about this many times, but that's what I think it initially stems from, is just a misunderstanding of the lines of authority and a lack of compassion for individuals. I wish we could go further, but we're out of time. I know you can't continue it. Thank you so much for joining us. Joe Wolverton, newamerican.com. Stay with us. We'll be taking